So that is right. So.
It is my one you're going here.
They want to start fighting.
That was cool.
Yes, yes, yes. We should ask.
Good afternoon. We are about to begin. I want to welcome you on behalf of the Faculty of Social Sciences, and more specifically SALISES, to this session. I would like to recognize the Honorary Consul for Grenada, Mr. Ken Sylvester, Ambassador Gillian Bristol, who is the head of the Latin American and Caribbean Center. Also to recognize Bernard Court, former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance during the Revolution. Mr. Richard Jacobs, a colleague of mine of 40-odd years, and who also served in an ambassadorial capacity during the Revolution, and Senator Floyd Morris, aka Ray Charles, who also is one of my colleagues of many years. Just to indicate to the panelists the order of presentation, Professor Clinton Hutton will lead off, followed by Dr. Heather Ricketts, then Mr. Victor Burke, Dr. Jermaine McCalpin, Prof. Rupert Lewis, and Prof. Brian Meeks. I'm just giving this order to make sure that people are prepared. I've been asked to chair this session, I suppose in part because I worked during the Grenada Revolution in the Ministry of Planning between 1980 and 1983 as head of the macroeconomic planning unit, which was under Minister Bernard Court. I suppose that is why I've been picked to chair the session. I'm not a Grenadian, but I'm a Caribbean person, unashamedly so. Now, on March 13, 1979, some 46 NJM members attacked the Grenada Army barracks, overpowering Army soldiers. And by the end of the day, the New Julian movement had seized state power and the Grenada Revolution was born. The fundamental objective of the revolution, the first of its kind in the English-speaking Caribbean, was to promote growth and development, as well as improving the quality of life of all Grenadians. This process lasted for over 4 years and ended when the United States of America invaded Grenada on October 19, 1983, ending 4 years of an attempt to reconstruct an economy and society in the interests of all Grenadians. So today, the faculty and SALISES has organized this session 40 years after reflections and implications of the Grenada Revolution. And we have a panel with a lot of expertise and experience on the process, and who we have selected to share with us all some of the critical aspects of the revolutionary process in terms of their own reflections and an assessment of the implications of the Grenada Revolution. The first presenter is my colleague, Professor Clinton Hutton. And by the way, for those who may feel offended, I'm not going to read a very long biography. I know some people find long biographies to be a part of their modus operandi, so forgive me if I do not do that. And people who want to know who you are can Google you. So, Clinton Hutton is a professor of Caribbean political philosophy, culture, and aesthetics in the Department of Government here at Mona, and he will be presenting images of the revolution. Over to you, Clinton.
Good afternoon. Yeah, I was 24 years old when Eric Gary and his regime were overthrown in Grenada. And just about the age group of most of the persons who made the revolution. They were mainly in their 20s and their 30s. And I heard about the revolution after 2 days after it took place. That is shocking. And but my response to it, I had an immediate response. Is a struggle photo files, struggle newspaper, the organ of the Workers' Party of Jamaica. I was working on struggle newspaper. I lay out page design, cartoons, and responsible editorially for page 7. Rupert Lewis was the editor of Struggle at the time. He was always editor of the Struggle. But what happened after 1983? The two big office files, cabinets of Struggle newspaper, with hundreds of photographs taken throughout the 1970s. Photographs otherwise would not have been taken because it's taken from a particular perspective, focusing on workers, communities, inner city and rural, and rural workers and so on and so forth. After 1983, I went up to the office of the Workers' Party of Jamaica, and the 2 files with hundreds of photos were out under a shed and really rained out. A lot of water. When I opened the cabinet, most of the photos were unretrievable. I was able to save some, and even those that I saved, they were in terrible condition. I kept them until the electronic technology, photographic technology developed, Photoshop, and I was able to clean up some of them, still doing it because there are some more. And those that I'm going to show you today, they are photos from, struggle photos of the Grenadian Revolution. And these are, could you turn off the lights? Okay. So, I mean, there are some photos that I actually, there are some images that I took, beginning with remnants of colonialism. That's where we're coming. It's shaped, the genealogy of colonialism, slavery and post-slavery, shape what we are today. And these are just a few images that I took in Grenada. And forts, there are forts all over the Caribbean. This one is a special one. And this is my first response to the revolution. This cartoon was carried in the Struggle newspaper in this the first edition of Struggle that dealt with the Grenadian Revolution, carried that cartoon. And these are images that were painted fairly recently of the Grenadian Revolution. And they are on the cover of the 2 books done so far by Bernard Court. But these are the photos, the images that I was able to save from the Grenadian, from the struggle file.
Clinton, you don't want to comment on some of the photographs for those who may not.
I want to speak after.
Okay.
But not specifically on the photographs. Well, there are people here who are not familiar with some of the persons there. That's true. This is a cultural group in Grenada. And the program, adult education program, which was very popular. This young man was a part of it. He is now a real big man, right? Yes. And a lot of volunteer work took place, repairing houses, built houses, and so on. But there are, of course, lessons to learn from all of these. How, for example, do you use the concept of volunteerism to develop institutions? Volunteerism is more than just a concept and a practice. The philosophy of it, what it does in shaping unity and social relationship. How do we develop that to a national level? That is non-partisan. These are some of.
Paul Schoon, yes. Yes, he was retained after the revolution. Yeah, it's like how Gigi would have been retained after the revolution. You recognize this person? Yeah. Professor Patsy Lewis, yes. And of course, this is the global Caribbean reach of the revolution. What I would like to see is a book on the Grenadian Revolution. There can be entire title, for example, on culture and the importance of culture in shaping social relationship and in shaping identity. We need to do more of that. And the response of the Caribbean people, which was enormous to the Grenadian Revolution. Yes, there are a couple of articles in Struggle newspaper. This was when Maurice came to Jamaica for the CARICOM conference. Yes? Oh boy. He was in the Assembly Hall addressing a gathering, and I'm actually in that photo. Right down there. Right behind there, yeah. That's Lambert on the right, yeah. Lambert Brown, yeah. And this is when they tried to blow up the leadership of the revolution, and 2 girls were killed. And in fact, this one, a school was named after her, high school. And when the Americans came in, they changed the name. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, yes. Yeah. And these are some photos showing Grenada as it is. Beautiful place. The first place I've been to outside Jamaica and say I would live there. Yes. All right, so that's in closing. There are just a few things I would like to raise in terms of emphasis. One is that colonialism after 1945 was so odious that it was unable to remain as an occupying force in other people's places. And so what happened after that, in the process of independence, and it carried on to this day, in the process of independence, what the colonial, former colonial governments have done, Europe, the United States, was to choreograph the division between the people who were colonized. It's very important to know that. And therefore, the leadership of post-colonial societies has to be exceedingly conscious in relation to the issue of power, in relation to the issue of centralized and decentralized power, in relationship to the role that culture can play in shaping societies, and so on. And therefore, what has actually happened if you look at the history of of intervention in the region, there is, what we have is these external powers using the division amongst the people to strengthen those divisions, and especially in two ways. One is to get neo-colonial forces within the state, within the country, the former colony, to actually do for them what they are unable to do by occupying those countries, because they could no longer occupy those countries. So what they rely on are social forces that are able to express neo-colonial, not just neo-colonial sentiments, but policies that actually gave away the resources to foreign powers. And that is a case confronting Venezuela today. It's a case in Haiti at US occupation. It's a case all over the Caribbean, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, and so on. And it continues to this day. So I will just end there, and during question and answer period, I can say more. Thank you.
Thank you, Clinton. I just want to welcome Ambassador Gillian Bristol. I welcomed you in your absence, but I'm going to welcome you again, who is the head of the Latin American and Caribbean Center, and who was the former ambassador to the US. Now, today we will also integrate culture, as Clinton had identified, a very important element in the process. And the president of the Grenadian Student Society, Trelona Charles, will make a presentation of a poem by Merle Collins entitled Callaloo.
Good afternoon. Mix up like callaloo. Not no watery callaloo, but a hot, thick, sweet callaloo. Burning your tongue with them chunker dumpling going down. Nice. And with coconuts, with or without deaders, as the case may be, as the taste may be, as the pocket may be, but sweet and hot. That is what it feels like to be a part of this revolution reality, of this waking up reality, of this no more hiding your passport reality, no more hanging your head and shuffling your foot and trying to hide behind the person in front of you, like little Janet behind she mother's skirt, when the man asks, "Where you from?" No more playing you do here, or saying something like, a island nearby Trinidad, or a few miles off Venezuela, but out, loud and bold, like you make the name, Grenada. And with your head in the air, because the world is yours, and you know it's yours. And you're not going to be meek, and wait to see if somebody go let you inherit the earth, because you know already it's yours. And so you say loud and clear and proud, Grenada. And your silent scream, which he must be here, because he look up into your claiming eyes, says, that mean revolution. That mean progress. That mean forward. That means sharing and caring, and believing and living, and loving. That means a country in the Caribbean, in Latin America, in the Americas, in the struggle in the world. That means comrade. A people like the people in Cuba, in Nicaragua, in Zimbabwe, in struggling South Africa, in all them countries, where the people know that though donkey say the world ain't level, even donkey himself must be the shake his head to feel them bumps and know how things so hard for some toe and soft for others. All are we in all of this world so mixed up like Callaloo, and yet so not like Callaloo. And that is why the change and the promise of the change is sweet and strong. Like the soup when Granny cover it down there and let it consume me. Like that hot, sweet, burning, heavy Callaloo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chelona, for that very stimulating presentation. The next presenter is Dr. Heather Ricketts, who is from Grenada and who's a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology, Psychology, and Social Work, aka the long-name department. And she will speak on the Gary years, a painful recollection of the 1970s. Heather.
Thank you. While today's symposium marks the 40th anniversary of the Grenada Revolution, I thought that it was important and necessary to paint the context within which the revolution occurred. So my remarks, therefore, attempt a personal recollection of life under Premier and later Prime Minister Eric Gary, highlighting two events which would drive support for revolutionary thinking and provide some impetus to revolutionary sympathies. I use authoritative sources to fact check my memory. George Brizan, in his book, Grenada, Island of Conflict, asserts that, quote, the history of Grenada between 1968 and 1979, but especially between 1973 and 79, illustrates Gary's hopes that after 1967, he could perpetuate himself in power, even against popular wishes, by essentially three strategies. By making as many people as possible economically dependent upon the government and upon himself in order to control them politically. Two, by crushing dissent and by making it difficult, if not impossible, for parliamentary opposition to operate and perform. By 1979, Parliament had become his personal property. By creating a highly centralized bureaucracy where decision-making depended on the cabinet, which in effect was Gary himself. In the process, there were many occasions on which people's constitutional rights were violated, end quote. Brizan highlights how Gary's Land for the Landless program, and that was a program between 1971 and 72, saw the state acquire many of the large estates which were owned by persons opposed to his government, and how Gary never paid for some of the land and never subsidized subdivided many of the estates to give over the land to the landless. Brizan notes that this was Gary's way of, quote, breaking the economic power of those medium and large landowners opposed to the government, and to control the workers on these estates by making them directly dependent on the government for their livelihood, end quote. He goes on to show how between 1972 and 75, Gary presided over the state takeover of cooperatives, the banana cooperative, the nutmeg, and the cocoa cooperatives. These crops, bananas, nutmegs, and cocoa, were the mainstay of the Grenadian economy at the time. All boards that were elected by growers were abolished and replaced by government-nominated interim boards. Joseph Lane, in his book, We Move Tonight, corroborates and sharpens Brizan's account, noting that To entrench his dominance over the state machinery, Gary pursued a policy of naked victimization. In the bureaucracy, the police, prison service, education structures, and health system, he fired left, right, and center, people who opposed him, and replaced them with his supporters. And for additional muscle, he institutionalized and gave free rein to his Tonton Macoots, referred to by Grenadians as the Mongoose Gang, end quote. I grew up in that Grenada. My real consciousness about political affairs and repressive rule and governance began in 1973 when I was 8. It really started on account of the Bloody Sunday event in November of that year, when members of the New Jewel movement were brutally beaten by Gary's Mongoose Gang. I'll come back to that specific event a little later. My brothers and I had tagged along with our parents when they went to visit their beaten up friends at Dr. Friday's nursing home in Richmond Hill, which wasn't far, or isn't far, from where we live and from where the prison is. They were visiting them on their way home after work. What I remembered were fractured jaws, bandaged, bottle-shaved heads, and bruised bodies. Maurice, Selwyn, and Unison stood out in terms of the extent of their injuries. These were men that my family knew very well. Maurice lived at Parade, just 2 corners from Creighton, where I grew up. I lived in a GNP household and family that became increasingly despondent supporters of the party. That's the GNP, Grenada National Party. They didn't think that Blaze, Herbert Blaze, the party leader, was an adequate match for Gary, and perhaps he was too laid back. They therefore became very sympathetic to the NJM's agenda. That too came in for its fair share of frustration, as neither the GNP nor the NJM was able to beat Gary at the polls. The 1976 elections stand out, as there was every hope that the coalition that included the NJM would win the elections, but it lost to Gary's GULP, Grenada United Labour Party, by 3 seats, so 9-6. There were charges of vote rigging, voter suppression, and electoral fraud. Discussions about politics were a lot of the conversation that took place at home and among the wider family and friends. My parents were civil servants, and the everyday conversations were complaints about Gary's interference in the civil service, his interference in the recruitment process. My father was treasurer of the Civil Service Association up to 1975, later becoming president, so he had first-hand knowledge. Gary's repressive regime, coupled with squandering of public resources, led to conflict with the main trade unions. He would overrule the Public Service Commission, impose anybody, anywhere in the civil service. It didn't matter if the person recruited was qualified or not. Conversations also involved Gary's attempts at suppressing any form of opposition, particularly the unions, any opposing political parties or individuals. And that would normally or naturally lead into hushed conversations at home about the secret police and the Mongoose Gang. My parents knew many of these guys as well. One couldn't be found possessing certain material that was deemed seditious. Some of these were the Jewel newspaper produced by the NJM, the 1972 book Ruler in Hiruna, which I've never read and I hope to read, and the Duffus report. Those had to be kept hidden in case one's house was searched by the secret police. The Jewel, as Lane describes, was a paper that pursued a militant editorial policy and served to awaken the consciousness of the Grenadian populace to the ills of the decadent Gary regime and to galvanize the masses into action against Gary. I don't remember being able to openly acquire the Jewel newspaper. One had to be careful, but the paper easily found its way into homes through bus drivers and conductors plying the St. George's to St. Paul's route. The atmosphere at the time was a political hotbed. Brutality was the order of the day. The Mongoose Gang would terrorize known Gary opponents. The youth, particularly young men, were not spared. As many authors note, the NGM had captured the imagination of the youth in Grenada. And so young people, including secondary students, were not an uncommon sight among mass demonstrations which took place regularly between 1973 and 74. Student councils were conscious and alive in Grenadian politics. The perception of youth as a threat to Gary was real. You know, there's a new word these days called woke. They were woke, largely on account of the NGM's organizing ability and the consciousness-raising activities. Gary branded the NGM leadership as, quote, just a bunch of communists out of university, hot and sweaty, end quote. From known anti-Gary communities, anyone found liming on a corner after hours risked being beaten by the secret police. My father's nephew, who lived with us, would regularly have to run for cover when the secret police appeared out by the gap, you know, the entrance to our road, to break up any congregating. Such congregating was unwelcome. My father eventually appealed to his sister, that's my cousin's mother, who had left for England in the 50s, to send for him. And he left Grenada in 1975 at the age of 20, much to my parents' relief. So I come now to accounting or recounting Bloody Sunday and Bloody Monday, and then I will conclude. Bloody Sunday, it's known as Bloody Sunday. On November 4, 1973, the NGM held a People's Congress in Grenville. Well, we call anywhere in St. Andrews Grenville. The books you read will say St. Andrew, but we say Grenville, with a lot of support. They presented their manifesto, which included a program to make Grenada genuinely independent. They also presented a list of 27 indictments against Gary. He was found guilty of all 27 charges, and he was given 2 weeks to give up power. If he didn't give up power, the Congress agreed that they'd call a general strike to wrest power from him. So on the day of the deadline for Gary to resign, this was November the 18th, 6 of the leaders of the NGM were ambushed coming from Grenville, where they had gone to finalize plans for the general strike if Gary had failed to resign. Of course, they were brutalized by the Mongoose gang, hauled before a magistrate, given no bail, and sent off to prison. At some point, they were then taken to Dr. Stan Friday's medical clinic, where my family had visited. I had spoken about that earlier. That brutality unleashed on what we now call Bloody Sunday, November 18, 1973, backfired. And it resulted in serious anti-Gary demonstrations. There was a show of national unity. Every group came out in solidarity against Gary. In fact, Brizant says that an unprecedented number of about 25,000 people came out marching, and that's a quarter of the Grenadian population. He notes that, Brizant, for 1 month in January 1974, the island was locked in a general strike, and the streets were filled with thousands of Grenadians, young and old, demonstrating and chanting, Gary must go. And I remember that. G-O, go! Gary must go! And then they'd sing, you know, that song, We Shall Not Be Moved. Like a tree that's planted by the water, we shall not be moved. So we would have been children standing on the demonstration line. My father would have been in the CSA, my mother, everybody demonstrating. And we would be on a Saturday, you know. Even the governor, Dame Hilda Baino, was not spared the opposition, with some demanding that she too must go, which she eventually did, resigning and migrating to Trinidad. Gary responded violently to those demonstrations, invoking his secret police. The NGM had been organizing a demonstration to begin on Carnage when Gary seemed to have got wind of it, and he had unleashed his gang. He called them to a meeting at his official residence in Mount Royal on Monday, January 21, 1974, otherwise called Bloody Monday, and he gave them instructions to head to the Carnage. So I come to Bloody Monday. I had been standing downstairs of my old nursery school on Lucas Street with my younger brother waiting for our parents to pick us up to go home for lunch. In those days, school stopped at midday, you went home for lunch, and you returned. People didn't eat on the road and that kind of thing. We attended St. George's Anglican Junior and Senior School, which wasn't far away. We witnessed firsthand the Mongoose Gang having been dispatched from Mount Royal. So you Grenadians in here, you know where Mount Royal is. And as you leave this, Lucas Street, you're coming down. So we were standing on Lucas Street. So he dispatches them from Mount Royal, coming down the street like a band of hoodlums, chanting. And I remember that chant like it was yesterday. Jewel, if you don't behave yourself, we go try you for murder. And they had batons, pieces of wood. They were dressed in torn-up shorts and headbands. As children, we were curious but afraid. We had already known how deadly these men could be. When our parents picked us up and we reached our gap to turn in, there was a congregation of persons sharing news of who had been beaten up and who had been shot. And then the news came of Mr. Bishop's killing, that's Maurice's father, and how students from my school, well, I eventually went to the Anglican High School, and the Grenada Boys Secondary School had to jump into the sea on the carronage to escape being shot. There was a pall of gloom all over the community. No one knew what else to do or how to move Gary. Chaos reigned. Mass looting took place. Schools suspended for days. So Bloody Monday has to be understood within the context of opposition to the impending independence under Gary. According to Ewart Lane, there was great apprehension and indeed downright fear in many quarters about what life would be in Grenada under absolute control of Eric Gary. Demonstrations mounted calling for Gary to go. That's the GO go. Gary has to go, bound to go, must go. The unions, nurses, teachers, dock workers locked down the country, crippling everything. There was no commerce, there was no electricity, there was no cooking gas, there was no petrol. Food was scarce, and many of us had to rely on traffickers who plied between Grenada and Trinidad and Grenada and St. Vincent. My mother is Trinidadian, so about every fortnight, her family would send us a box or two of grocery by one of the boats. That's how we kept life and limb going. Independence, and I'm closing, independence came in spite of. So this is January 21, 1974. And when do we get independence? The 7th of February, 1974. 2 weeks later. Brizan comments that, quote, the coming of independence in Grenada differed from similar experiences in the then 5 other independent Caribbean countries. In Grenada, it was marked by periods of bitter rivalry between government and opposition forces from early 1973 to February 1974, end quote. Merle Collins, writing in the SCS, baldly states the simple reality that, quote, on 7 February 1974, in the midst of darkness, Grenada became an independent nation in the British Commonwealth, end quote. For her, quote, it was after this, when in spite of the fact that the NGM had the massive support of the majority of people, and there were constant massive demonstrations, but it was unable to unseat Gary, that the party appears to have decided to move to the organization of a vanguard that could be a tight core of leaders, end quote. Lane asserts that it raised another question, quote, how was the growing revolutionary movement to respond to the use of force by Gary to crush the revolutionary tide, end quote. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this vivid, painful recollection of that period of Grenada's history. And I'm sure colleagues will have questions if they will want to raise in our question time. Our next speaker is V. Nazim Burke, typically known as Naz. Naz is a Grenadian, an economist, attorney at law, and politician. I don't know the order. Naz worked during the revolution as permanent secretary in the Ministry of Trade. I was involved in a number of the negotiations which the PRG had with the international financial institutions and different governments all over the world. Naz became a politician and became a member of parliament in 2003, serving for 10 years. And during that period, he was appointed Minister of Finance, Planning, Economy, Energy, and Cooperatives in Grenada. So he came from being a PS during the revolution, and then later on, in 2003, an elected member of the House, and then Minister of Finance. Naz will present on the strategic underpinnings of the Program of Economic and Technical Cooperation of the Grenada Revolution. Naz.
Good afternoon to all of the presenters and the participants, all of the members of the audience who are present. I want to recognize some of the persons you recognized, Bernard Cord, Ambassador Bristol, Mr. Ken Sylvester, and others. Good afternoon, everybody. The 40th anniversary of the Grenada Revolution, I hope you see me, provides a great opportunity to reflect upon the historic event which occurred on March 13, 1979, in particular its genesis, and the process which followed, the process reflecting its accomplishments, its shortcomings, and indeed its demise. Each aspect of this revolution, the genesis, the accomplishments, the shortcomings, and demise, can be, and indeed has been, the subject of extensive analysis by revolutionary participants, by legitimate academics and historians, even by some imposters, having no knowledge or understanding of the events and processes which came to be known as the Grenada Revolution. While each aspect engenders its own emotional and psychological journey and provides its own lessons, perhaps the aspect which provides the most valuable and long-lasting lessons is the astonishing feats that the revolution was able to accomplish in the short 4.5 years of its existence. For in a tiny island of 342 square kilometers, with a population of 110,000 people, no oil, no mineral resources, a per capita GDP of about $1,200 US at the time, and only 5 years old as an independent nation, a revolutionary government was able, in those 4.5 years, to build an international airport, establish 2 secondary schools, establish 2 commercial banks, establish an agro-industrial plant, and extend low-interest loans to small farmers and agricultural cooperatives, establish a fishery school, a national fishing fleet, and a fish processing plant, a housing plant capable of producing 500 prefab housing units per year, a national transportation service, a marketing and national importing board, a national insurance scheme. A Center for Popular Education was established with the aim of eradicating illiteracy by 1985, and secondary education became a right for every Grenadian student. It provided hundreds of Grenadian students with scholarships to attend universities or advanced technical education. Agricultural training was also a feature of the period, with an agricultural training school established. By 1982, by the end of 1982, 32 state-owned enterprises have been established, producing approximately 25% of all of the goods and services on the island. Unemployment had fallen from 50% to 12%, and there had been a significant increase in the social wage, with 1/3 of the country's budget dedicated to health and education. In the history of our country, no government, either before or after, has ever been able to accomplish this feat, or repeat this feat. Colleagues, it should be noted that this monumental accomplishment occurred at a time in human history when there were no personal computers, no tablets, no fax machines. In fact, the fax machine had not yet been invented. No cell phones, no internet, no Wi-Fi, no Facebook, no WhatsApp, no Snapchat, no Twitter, no Instagram. All of these things were accomplished during that very period without the benefit of the scientific and technological revolution. The many factors which account for this incredible achievement have been and will remain the subject of much discussion and debate. It can hardly be disputed, however, that among the ones which would feature prominently among those factors are the following. 1, the existence of a clear development program by the revolution. 2, the quality of revolutionary leadership that was provided by the leaders. 3, the broad support of the masses enjoyed by the revolution. 4, the cadre of technical workers that came in from other countries, especially regional countries, but international as well. 5, the energy and enthusiasm of the masses. 6, the sound management of the economy, and in that regard I think it is well known that Bernard Cord was legendary in the way that he managed the national economy. 7, a brilliant strategy of engagement with the multilateral institutions, in particular the International Monetary Fund. And last but not least, the internationalist support and assistance that it was able to muster through a consciously driven and well-orchestrated program of economic and technical cooperation with targeted countries among the community of nations. It is to this last factor that I wish to confine the remainder of my remarks. For it is my firm belief that no meaningful evaluation of the Grenada Revolution can be undertaken without an understanding and appreciation of the role played by economic and technical cooperation with other countries in that process. This is so important in my view that it is perhaps deserving of a study in its own right. To fully appreciate this point, it is necessary to consider the global socio-economic and political context in which the revolution emerged and existed. It was a period of time in which one can perhaps say the dominant features were as follows: the sounding of the death knell of colonial domination, the rise of the national liberation movements, and the intensification of the national liberation struggle, the emergence of a few poor, small, fledgling independent nations, the height of the Cold War, exemplified by superpower rivalry and the dangerous pursuit of the quest for global preeminence on the part of the key players, each seeking to bring political movements and independent nations within their own sphere of influence, rewarding those who came within their orbit and ostracizing or at minimum alienating those who fell outside of their orbit and in the orbit of the competitor. In those circumstances, the challenges facing small independent nations was how best to survive in this dangerous global environment given its small size and limited human, financial, material, and technical resources. It was against this backdrop and in the face of these challenges that the PRG devised its program of economic and technical cooperation. What were the elements of this program? How did this program manifest itself? I think the following are worthy of note. First, there was a very clear plan of what they wanted to achieve in the area of economic and social development. Second, they had a very clearly defined set of needs, what would be necessary to achieve their goals. Third, they quickly established diplomatic relations with the socialist bloc of countries. They fostered close fraternal ties with Cuba, with the USSR, the GDR, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, North Korea. They joined the non-aligned movement and quickly developed diplomatic and fraternal relations with other non-aligned states, including such countries as Libya, Syria, Vietnam. They established amicable working relations with Western governments who were not ill-disposed and not predisposed to open hostility, such as the countries of the European Union and Canada. They quickly determined what each of these countries had that we needed, and through what means they were going to try to get what these countries had to offer, whether by way of grants, loans, technical assistance, or favorable terms of trade, both in terms of selling our exports and in importing the items that were needed. Two critical points are worthy of mention here. The first is the way that diplomatic relations and the role of diplomats was viewed by the revolution. Diplomats and diplomatic relations were not viewed as an opportunity to simply hobnob with people from other countries, an opportunity to engage and have light chatter or light banter, or an opportunity to simply pick up intelligence that may or may not be useful. Diplomacy was seen not as an end in itself, but primarily as creating the entry point through which the economic program, the program of economic and technical cooperation was going to be established, strengthened, maintained, and pursued to the mutual benefit of the countries concerned. I think this is extremely important. How we see diplomacy and the economic function of diplomacy is something that the revolution understood and appreciated, perhaps in a way that many countries do not today. The second point that I would make in that regard is that for the first time in the history of our country, and perhaps the last time in the history of our country, a technical and material supplies plan was developed as part of the budget process. This involved developing and elaborating a plan of the needs of all the public ministries and state enterprises for technical supplies and equipment, and arranging to procure those through the activities of the state. So whether it was tractors that we had to purchase for the Ministry of Agriculture, or trucks for the Ministry of Works and the Communications Department, tires for the vehicles, papers for the offices, typewriters, a plan was developed that actually was able to determine what was the government's need and the state enterprises' need in all of these areas, cumulatively, and be able then to purchase these things in bulk, rather than simply going to the local supplier who was going to be able to sell it to us at much higher prices and without enjoying the benefit of the discounts that would be that can be realized if you were to purchase these items in bulk. So the pursuit of a strategy in diplomacy and the pursuit of a technical and material supplies planning process were very central to this initiative and process by the government. I don't know whether we can say that this program of economic and technical cooperation was in fact the silver bullet. I have my belief that it was. But even if it were, it would not be fair to say that it was the single transformational factor accounting for the socio-economic achievements of the revolution. Because complementing this component were two other critical components which I do believe we ought to mention, and which we do not have the time to explore here. The first is the vision and capacity to recruit a powerful cadre of technical experts, sympathetic to the Grenada experiment from around the world, but especially from the region, to assist, and in some cases to lead the effort in particular areas, the economy, agriculture, health, education, and so many areas. And second, the strategic and tactical prowess as a revolutionary small third world country to successfully engage, negotiate with, and exact from the multilateral institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, but the IMF in particular, concessional loans on terms unusually favorable without having to agree to subject ourselves to the harsh anti-worker terms and conditions that these countries were being asked to subject themselves to in those days. The question then must now be asked, what useful lessons, if any, can we extract from this program, from this experience, this experiment in economic and technical cooperation? In answering this question, it is perhaps appropriate to begin by making the observation that while the Cold War has ended and the circumstances that existed in 1979 to 83 seem far removed from the world we live in today, in particular one must note the advent of the scientific and technological revolution, a careful examination will reveal that the challenges faced by our countries today are not as dissimilar from those which existed in that period as they might appear at first blush. Today, our countries are still small with limited human, material, financial, and technical resources. We live in a globalized environment in which the competition for grants, loans, foreign investments, both direct and indirect, and markets are harsh and unrelenting. The source of that competition today is not simply our developmental equals, but the bigger and stronger guys are also in the schoolyard who can bully us. Today, we must contend with the forces and consequences of climate change, including the financial consequences, in a manner and in a magnitude that we were not required to in 1979 to 83. We must face the inescapable reality of extreme weather events, hurricanes, floods, increased natural disasters, earthquakes, volcanoes, rising sea levels, and so on. Today, as it was in 1979, the challenge facing the small, independent nation remains how best to survive in this dangerous global environment, given its small size and limited human, financial, material, and technical resources, and I dare add, existential threat from the forces and consequences of climate change. The program of economic and technical cooperation adopted by the People's Revolutionary Government in 1979 may well offer some very useful clues to this very daunting puzzle. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Naz, for raising some very important issues, policy-oriented issues which are relevant as we speak for SIDS in general, but more so for Caribbean SIDS. Our next presenter is Dr. Jermaine McCalpin, formerly of the Department of Government and now an assistant professor and director of the Afro-American Studies Program, the African American Studies Program at New Jersey City University. Jermaine will be presenting on silence and disappearance, truth and reconciliation in post-revolutionary Grenada.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to start with full disclosure. When the Grenada Revolution occurred, I was 7 months old. So this is an attempt to bridge the generational divide. My focus for this 10-minute talk deals with the question of truth and reconciliation. And some background context is necessary to understand the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Grenada. And this was established in September 4th, 2001. And it was the government's attempt to deal with the question of memory. How do we move on from the trauma of post-revolutionary Grenada, and what do we remember? And interestingly, what do we forget? I recall in October 1983, when I was listening to Ghana News Radio with my mother, as we often did back then in the 1980s in Jamaica. I listened to Ghana News Radio broadcast, and it simply said, Prime Minister of Grenada, Maurice Bishop, was assassinated. The first thing that came to mind was, why would anyone want to kill a Prime Minister? That was what I asked my mother. She couldn't answer the question, and I've spent the last 30-odd years attempting to answer the question. As I've gotten older, I've realized that the question and the answer to it is far more deeper and far more complicated than that initial question. I want to therefore talk about the role of the Truth Commission and whether or not it achieved its stated goals. First thing I want to say is that the Grenadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, established in 2001, was quite an abysmal failure. So I'll just get that out of the way. I say this unequivocally because there's absolutely no way you could inquire into certain political events from 1976 to 1991 without ever interviewing one of the Grenada senators. There's absolutely no way you can get to any modicum of truth without interrogating the process of the past. And I say this primarily because the Grenadian Truth Commission attempted to model the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission without the proper structure and without the proper process. I want to focus on 4 points dealing with silence and disappearance. And the disappearance I'm talking about is the disappearance of truth. Merle Collins, in her poetry work, describes a very apropos discussion, and she says, the silence we have been keeping about the Grenada Revolution. I want to ask, and I want to interrogate, based on what I read in the Truth Commission report published in September 2001, what is reconciliation? And how can reconciliation occur without involving the Grenada 70s? The second point I want to focus on is truth-telling, and the reality that truth-telling is a risky enterprise. Truth-telling has consequences, and whether or not societies are prepared to deal with the consequences of truth-telling. Third, I think reconciliation is often assumed to be an inevitable byproduct of truth-telling, but it is not the case. Reconciliation is far more complicated, and oftentimes it is frustrated by truth-telling. If we need any other evidence, we can turn to South Africa. After over 20 years of the South African Truth Commission, reconciliation has only taken place at the level of the political. When we talk about reconciliation, how have the Grenada 17 been reincorporated into the Grenadian society as well as the Caribbean political imagination? How have we interpreted the role of the Grenada 17 in the history of the Grenada Revolution? I think maybe the point that I'm most concerned with is the idea that truth commissions can often result and are often the result of political gimmickry. The then Prime Minister established the Truth Commission, and he said he wanted to ensure that the truth about Grenada's past was described and was engaged in the Truth Commission. I will read an excerpt, and you can be the judge as to how the Truth Commission achieved its goals. The terms of reference of the Truth Commission of Grenada argues that it attempted to inquire into certain political events between January 1st, 1976 and 1991. Less than 3 paragraphs later, it confesses that in its intensive and extensive search, it failed to uncover any new truths about the Grenada Revolution. That to me is telling, because there's no way they could have unearthed new political truths without ever consulting the Grenada Center. And I think the Caribbean Studies Association in June of 2013, we had the Caribbean Studies Conference in Grenada, and for the first time ever constituted, 9 of the 17 of the Grenada 17 participated in a very frank discussion. And I think I left that meeting with this idea that there's far more to tell than we've been told about the Grenada Revolution. But the question becomes, how does a society move on from mass crime? Having studied 10 of the 55 Truth Commissions, there are some things that the Grenada Truth Commission failed to do, and therefore ends up frustrating the process of reconciliation. I think the first and maybe most obvious, as I pointed out, is that it attempted to mimic the legacies of the South African Truth Commission without properly understanding the unique nature of the South African experience. I think when we talk about truth commissions, most persons assume that truth commissions are grand confessionals where people will come and confess their sin. Truth commissions require a far more nuanced notion of truth, and the Grenada Truth and Reconciliation Commission failed to acknowledge the complexity of truth. To reinforce this point, the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission argued that there were 4 types of truths. There was forensic truth, there was narrative truth, there was social truth, and there was truth as restorative conversation. None of these denominations of truths were interrogated by the Grenada Truth Commission. As a matter of fact, in my own research, I inquired of about 50 Grenadans while at the CSA, and none of them had ever heard of the Grenadian Truth and Reconciliation. Interestingly, it was almost kept secret because much of its work focused on politicizing the incarceration of the Grenada 17 rather than attempting to interrogate the truth that they need. And so this question of silence is not the question that there is no need to speak, it is that in speaking there is no audience to listen. So if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, did it fall? And that becomes part of the challenge of truth-telling mechanisms. If they are not publicized, and if they don't appeal to and involve a broad base of people, then we can't get to the truth. I'm still looking forward to that process of reconciliation that incorporates not just the testimony, but also the experiences of the Grenada 17. And I think until we deal with that process, we can't talk about truth-telling or about reconciliation. Reconciliation is a long-term goal, but I don't think even after 25 years, Grenada has fully reckoned with the demise of the Grenada Revolution. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Jermaine. Some very key issues posed, which we can no doubt discuss, and the relevance and usefulness of truth and reconciliation commissions in our region for those countries which are going through fundamental crisis. One country immediately comes to mind, my own country, Guyana, where there is a situation where there is no government, but elections are supposed to be held. There is confusion all around, and one is not clear as what is the truth and how will that be reconciled. Our next speaker is my neighbor, Professor Rupert Lewis, retired professor and professor emeritus in political thought in the Department of Government. And the title of Rupert's presentation is UWI Intellectuals and Caribbean Revolution.
Thank you very much, Clement. The Grenada Revolution was not a random or isolated event. It grew out of a period of mass political activity in the region. In the period 1968 to 1983, the idea of Caribbean Revolution from Jamaica through the islands down to Guyana and Suriname, that idea was very powerful among regional intellectuals and huge sections of the young population. Brian Meeks' 1993 book, Caribbean Revolutions and Revolutionary Theory, an assessment of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Grenada, reflects on this question for a wider area of the Caribbean. The idea of the Caribbean developed out of Black Power. You can't talk about the Grenada Revolution without speaking about the Black Power movement in the region. The movement around Walter Rodney had region-wide repercussions on all the campuses and non-campus territories. But the more important Black Power movement was the one in Trinidad. Half of the population of Grenada commutes or lives in Trinidad. So I'm saying a large section. But when I say commutes, they move, it not only commute, live, trade, do business in Trinidad. But before looking at Trinidad Black Power, I think this 1969 Sir George Williams student protest was a very important moment for the region, because Sir George Williams students came from all of the territories in the Caribbean. And in response to their trial for destroying the computer center, and they occupied and eventually destroyed that center because of the racism of a biology lecturer. So the 69 events in Sir George filtered throughout the Caribbean. And it was the reason why in 1970 February, when the Governor General of Canada visited the St. Augustine campus, along with Eric Williams, he was locked out of the campus. And the argument is that this was one of the issues that put Eric Williams off UWI eventually. However, in the case of Jamaica, the growth of the Abeng movement, a movement that focused on a newspaper but had organizational reach throughout the island, as well as in the Jamaican diaspora. I want to mention here in 1970 the Rat Island Conference. And the only person I see here who was at a Rat Island Conference was Trevor Monroe. The Rat Island Conference in St. Lucia was a meeting of the Caribbean left in the wake of the defeat of the Trinidad movement to determine strategy for the entire Caribbean region. There therefore was a regional movement all throughout the islands, and UWI was central in the connections that were established, because the Mona campus had been a base for the entire regional intelligence, which came of age in the 1970s. I want to recognize Richard Jacobs, who was ambassador of the Grenada to Cuba and to the Soviet Union in the 1979-83 period. And I had the privilege of reading a manuscript of his. And I am going to quote from it extensively so I don't misrepresent him in any way. This is Richard Jacobs talking to somebody called Hopper. And that person called Hopper is Bernard Cord. Okay, Hopper, write me a letter from Ministry of Finance to Vice Dean, Faculty of Social Sciences, St. Augustine. You need to request me to mobilize, quote, as many experts as possible from the various disciplines, including agro-processing, macroeconomics, governance, public administration. I will organize it via the Senate of the university. You need to say also the PRG will be responsible for internal transport and all accommodation for all members of the delegation. When Jacobs, who was Vice Dean in the Faculty of Social Sciences, St. Augustine, returned to Trinidad, he organized the trade unions in Trinidad, led by George Weeks and the oilfield workers, Joe Young, Basdeo Pandey, and the trade union supplied $1 million Trinidad to ensure that a delegation from the campus would be able to visit and stay and give some assistance. So within the current movement, there's not only youth activism, but a pretty vibrant trade union movement which underpinned the popular movement in the Caribbean. Then Jacobs goes on to talk about the Faculty of Social Sciences and the Board of Studies. And I want to quote the Board of Studies, the Social Sciences resolution. A 5-point resolution, it says, the social science faculty notes that the government of Grenada has changed. We also note that the new government has publicly declared its support for the UWI, undertaking to pay its outstanding bills and renew sending its students to UWI. 3, we note also that the government of Grenada has proposed to urgently utilize the experts of UWI to advise the new government on a wide range of developmental issues. Fourthly, the Faculty of Social Sciences welcomes the new position on UWI promised by the new government of Grenada. We are very anxious to help the government and look forward to early discussions to finalize the arrangements for UWI experts as requested by the new government. Fifthly, the Faculty of Social Science mandates the Vice Dean to take forward the proposals, act with all deliberate speed, and report back to the next meeting of the Social Sciences. Jacobs reports that he got full cooperation from the University of the West Indies, the officials, and they identified 35 areas of collaboration. Only 15 to 18 were in the Faculty of Social Sciences. The other experts were in other faculties. I asked the PVC for a special line. This was installed within 1 day to facilitate communication. Burke spoke about the technology at that time. A telephone line was a critical element in any dispensing of one's business. The Grenada, the UWI faculty played a critical role, St. Augustine. Also the Mona faculty played a critical role. Many people from the Mona faculty went to Grenada to work. There was, and people went, some went not only through formal channels, but just on their own, took themselves up and went. So in looking at Grenada, I want you to see a Caribbean vision. Now, the notion of a Caribbean revolution has many dimensions. I don't want to restrict it only to the Marxist dimension. People had a different sense of what possibilities for transformation existed in the region, and they were prepared to go there to resettle and to rebuild the revolution. This, for me, is one of the main achievements, that one can look at the scientific and technical aspects, but you have to also examine what is it that drove people independently, on their own account, to relocate to Grenada and to decide to give up their time. Some of us took no paid leave. I got a sabbatical to go to Prague. It's my 10 minutes. And to going to Prague, I interviewed Maurice Bishop, because my role there as a member of the Workers' Party of Jamaica was to make the linkages with not only Moscow, but all the Eastern European countries and international communist movement. That was my role. And I took a year of no pay leave. So did my wife, and her family was there. So I don't regard it as that being unique. It was part of a generational energy that is difficult to replicate in today's circumstances. But there may be ways in which one can tweak and work with energies. But to do the transformation, you need to have those energies and that voluntarism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rupert. I can empathize with that experience, because Bernard had called me to come down to work in the economy, and I went immediately to Vaughan Lewis. I was working with SALISES, and Vaughan didn't apply any bureaucratic constraints at all. He just told me when I'm ready, he will facilitate. I don't know if you touched on this, Rupert, but importantly, non-Grenadian Caribbean people, myself included, were welcome and accepted and fully integrated into the Grenadian society. It was not a case as if you're perceived as a quote-unquote foreigner, you're not from the country. But my own personal experience and the experience of many of my colleagues reflects this, that the Grenadian economy, the Grenadian society, Grenadian people welcomed us and recognized our commitment to the process there. Our final speaker is Professor Brian Meeks, again formerly of the Department of Government, who is now Professor and Chair of Africana Studies at Brown University. He's a political theorist, novelist, and poet, and he will present on the Caribbean then and now, problems, contingencies, and prospects. Brian.
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much for inviting me, Sam. I want to give a special shout out to all the Grenadians there, Ken, Gillian, Heather, I have to include you in that. And a special shout out to Grenadians. Hiller just smashed down Trinidad.
Power, so good.
We need to remember that Grenadians are irrepressible. About the heart of Calypso and Soca, the stage at the Queen's Park Savannah, and of 5 finalists in the Calypso King competition. 3 were from Grenada. This is remarkable. Recognizing nature of this little island and power of its culture. We Jamaicans like to talk about the power of our culture, and it is powerful. But we need to remember that this is an island of 100,000 people at home, and here maybe another 100,000 outside, all over the place.
400,000 Gillian says.
According to Rupert, whatever, I'm going to Rupert's comment. I am the Courtney Walsh of this presentation. I am taking up the end, and therefore I could be just 6, or I could be out on the first ball. So here we go. I have a couple of quick comments. I want to make some comments on the international situation, followed by a few comments on the politics of the Grenada Revolution. And I want to end on the question of the sublime and the beautiful. On the question of the international situation, I think we need to think very carefully about the moment of the Grenada Revolution and its similarity in post-war Caribbean and Latin America. Because if we think about post-war history, we think about our friends in Guatemala in 1954 and how that attempt at a model of progressive revolutionary development was put down. If we move beyond that to think about obviously the Cuban Revolution and the attempt at Bay of Pigs, it was turned away, but which continues to this day as a result of that failure at Bay of Pigs. If you think about Bush in the DR in 1965 and the entrance of the United States, you think about Trinidad in 1970 when many people now come to the conclusion that US boots were actually on the ground in Chaguaramas. Though they didn't have to follow through because the rebellious regiment actually backed down and therefore prevented actually the emergence of Marines as a force in Trinidad society at that point in time. If you think about Allende in Chile in 1972. If you think about the concerted and successful attempt to destabilize Jamaica between 1976 and 1980, and to move beyond the Grenada Revolution, to think about the overthrow of Noriega in Panama in 1989, then there is a very clear and consistent pattern of US interventionism to put down resistance in this progressive regimes or movements against its interests in this part of the world. Of course, Venezuela is simply the latest in that well-known pattern of intervention using whatever tools are available. If the problem is oil, then you can squeeze them where it matters, make the economy scream. And then at the moment when you think you have them by the neck, disinformation. So the media, not only the traditional right-wing media, but the liberal center media, all of a sudden gets stupid, you know. It's able to delve into the inner cores of the Trump regime. But when it comes to just walking around Venezuela and seeing what is really going on, they suddenly get dumb. You know, and they're unable to really do the digging that they're able to do when the politics has to do with U.S. imperialism. So I just wanted to make the general point that Grenada occurred. How did it occur? It occurred in the only window of its kind in the second half of the 20th century. And I call it in my work a window of possibility. But that window of possibility was a very peculiar moment of the weakening of U.S. vigilance. And it surrounded the question of the Watergate crisis, the forcing out of Nixon, the Carter election, the mandate which Carter had, which was to practice a kind of transparent politics, for a moment considering a less imperialistic politics. All of these factors came to a head in the years between 1976, 77, and 1979. And it's not coincidental that Grenada occurs in 79 and is able to survive the actual true blue events, that is the taking of power from Gary. But that in the same year, Nicaragua and Iran occur and survive. So we need to think about that window as something that could not have happened in 1976. It could not have happened in 1980, 83. And there was a peculiar window which was accompanied by a regional correlationship of forces that allowed for immediate regional support for the Grenada Revolution. So that combination of US vigilance relaxed on the one hand, and on the other hand, a set of partners in the region which were either neutral or supportive, allowing the revolution to consolidate in a very, very, very narrow space. So whether or not the fighters of the PR, what will become the PRA, certainly of the NGN, were fully conscious of the really historical peculiarity of the moment, or whether they were just damn lucky. They operated at the time when they could operate, and there was literally no other time. Having taken power, the question was how you hold on to power when the United States reverts to its traditional strongman tactics with enormous resources to bear across the range of possible tactics, from disinformation to economic tools to tourism, and of course ultimately to using military force of one kind or another. And this is where the second part of my discussion begins, because we cannot celebrate the Grenada Revolution. We can commemorate the Grenada Revolution. But we have to realize that, and I'm not a conspiratorial theorist. Anybody who has read my work will know, but I don't make a case for Bernard and the surviving members of the Central Committee having had some sort of long distance plan to remove Morris. On the contrary, revolution, none of the people involved thought that there could be a revolution without some kind of consolidated leadership with Morris in it. But they messed up, and they messed up big time. And I think that any fair assessment of the revolution has to come to terms with the failure of the imagination. Failure of the imagination of a leadership which was able to see the opening in 1979, but not able to realize that that opening had shut, and that without the most careful, measured, social and political engineering of leadership, that there was going to be the worst possible response. And this is the space within which my criticism is made. It is not the sort of criticism which says that Bernard Cord and company had some plan, that there was this faction of young people in the revolution who were determined to put Cord into power. But it lies in the space that the entire leadership was guilty of, first of all, ideological fantasies. Secondly, of the worst kind of naive complacency. And thirdly, of a failure of imagination not to understand what was likely if any attempt was really made to shake up the leadership in a way which would cascade into the crisis that occurred. And of course, nobody expected the crisis to, in the beginning, I described it as a gridlock of events. That is to say, one thing leads to another, which leads to another, which leads to another, and there's no way back out from the one step that you have made. When you're in a gridlock of traffic, you can't reverse out, because when you look behind you see 20 different cars, and on the side is another 20 cars. You just have to sit down in your car and hold it and say, and lick your head and say, hope this traffic can get out. So there was a gridlock of events literally, from which there was no escape. And but how did that gridlock begin? Well, there are different ways we can measure it, and this is not the time to do that, because we simply don't have the time making the discussion. But certainly a crunch point was the notion of joint leadership. Right? And the days for joint leadership had passed. And the comrades who felt that they could return to that time were mistaken. And they were not conspiratorial, but they were utterly mistaken that that form of solution was a possible one in the correlation of forces which happened. So I just want to say a few things on that, and I want to conclude on the question of the sublime. And there was a little of it in Clinton's pictures, and there was some of it in a couple of comments made by Rupert and other persons, I think, in relation to people, certainly just faces in Clinton's pictures, first of all, but from Rupert, people picking up and heading to Grenada, dropping everything. That is, people in Grenada returning from various points in the world, leaving their studies behind, coming back to make a difference. Ordinary Grenadians, the degree of voluntarism which was generated during the revolution, the positive aspects of the revolution, such as the annual budget debate, which still sets a template for what is possible in popular involvement in deciding your own economic future, which I'm surprised that nobody mentioned before this, but I'm sure that everybody would agree with it. Parish councils, there are a lot of things there which are intangible, and most intangible of all was a spirit which existed in Grenada. I am not gainsaying the fact and the flaws of the detention of people, many of whom should not have been detained. I just let me put that on the table right away. You make a revolution, you're going to have to detain Gary's Mongoose gang members, and you're going to have to detain maybe some hardcore people who, if you don't detain them, next morning you're in trouble. The act of revolution is an authoritarian act. But there was a huge layer of people who need not have been detained, and which reflected in itself an authoritarian dimension to the revolution which needs to be questioned. So I'm not gainsaying that fact. But having said that, there was an intangible spirit, which is what I call the sublime of the revolution, which an opening up of possibility, a freeing of people's minds, a feeling that anything could be accomplished. This is an island of 100,000 people. You can lose it in Kingston. But having said that, it is also a nation. And that nation experienced an event which is rarely experienced in the world, but which is real and which has been lost in the tragedy of 1983. And we need to think about that and perhaps try to recapture it. I think Merle Collins does, and I'm going to end with a poem of my own. And in fact, I'm launching my poetry tomorrow night, my book of poetry. And I thought it might be useful, just as Merle Collins' poem, far more accomplished poet than myself, was read earlier on, to read this as a sort of reflection on the beautiful of the Grenada Revolution, which has been lost in the death of Morris Bishop and the crisis of 1983 and invasion. It's called Grenada. It was written a few days after the invasion. Though bombs drop amnesia and school days are over, I remember a wood-slatted bridge and the jungle green and the signs on every corner. I remember painted billboards, painted stones, forward ever, backward never. A bear hug up in Butler House, a soldier serene with his akka. Community center and Wednesday's militia. Enthusiasm, full regalia. Sunday nights with Valentino, Peter Tosh and Bonnie Wheeler. A front door open through the night, running on the sand in the morning sun. March morning on the Carnage, Glory and Fever, Steel Pan and Soca, Penguin, Teller and Explainer. Lambie down by Woburn, Oil down up at Tempe, Manikou in Happy Hill, Guava, Banana, Tambra and Nectar. Pioneers playing at Heinz's School, waiting on a bus in the market square, working all night and sleeping with rats beside a printing press. Smiling hopes on every corner, too thick to harness in a May 1st shower. Mother and father, son and daughter, brother and sister, come together. These I will never forget. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. And in your comments, I reflected on a comment made to me by Rex Nettleford of blessed memory when I came back after the implosion. He saw me and he said, the reason the revolution collapsed, Clay Martin, not many gray hairs. They didn't have enough gray hairs in the leadership. That was Rex's assessment. And maybe there's some merit to that. Now, we have roughly 45 minutes. Half an hour is, after half an hour, this technology is going to be eliminated. But therefore, I am suggesting, in terms of our questions and comments, that we use disproportionately the first section of the discussion to ask questions and make comments to colleagues who have presented from afar. And I will chair, but I will take questions as they come. First group of questions, please, or comments. Yes?
Michael.
Please identify yourself. Huh? Because my understanding is that this thing is being filmed and it will be accessible subsequently.
Thank you. Michael Barnett, lecturer in the Department of Sociology, Psychology, Social Work. I have to forgive the voice for the host today. Brian said something, I should say Professor Meeks in his presentation that we just heard, and he alluded to the significant number of detentions that occurred during the revolution. And I wanted to hear from not just Professor Meeks, but anyone else on the panel, their perspective on not only the contribution that Grenadian Rastafari made to the success of the Grenadian Revolution 40 years ago, but the subsequent detention and seeming lack of appreciation of the contribution of the Rastafari component to the Grenadian Revolution. Because when I was at CSA in 2013, I was able to pick up a couple of interviews that there was this disaffection by some members of the Rastafari community there to how they were treated after giving their contribution towards the revolution. So I'd like a perspective of the panelists and speakers on the treatment of and consideration of the Rastafari. And does it speak to the tenuous relationship that perhaps existed between people of a Rastafari persuasion and the left, the black left tradition?
Okay. Another question, comment?
Can I say something?
Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Now, okay, hi Michael, how are you doing? I think it was a category error on the part of the revolution, a category error. I mean, okay, and I'm sure that there are people there who will come in on this, and there were people in the Rastafari movement who were disaffected, and some of them felt that they were central to the whole thing, and they were acting against the revolution. And I can understand the distinction between people who are determined to overthrow it, in which case you have to say, well, boss, it's either us or you. I mean, this is a revolutionary situation. So there's that dimension to it. But there's another dimension in which I think that that the movement had not, or in the course of its development, had put Rasta to the back. You know, can I be rude here? You know, when I came from Jamaica, you know, I was told by my Jamaican colleagues, make sure you don't have a split, you know, because this is not Jamaica. In Jamaica, you can have a split and get away with it, but down here, them hard on them kind of things, right? And I'm leaving Jamaica in 1981, you know, a year into the new JLP government, but there was an almost orthodox Christian attitude towards Herb and towards, you know, many of the things that Rastafari considered as part of their culture within a culture, if you want. And I can partly understand what was going on in that the revolution was trying to not appear to be, how shall I put it, appear to be decent. And, you know, all of these cultural traditions of Rastafari were seen as not quite decent. But that in itself says a lot. So I think it was a category error not to have developed a different kind of relationship with those elements among Rastafari who were sympathetic or at least neutral, and ending up alienating a significant body of Rastafari. Having said that, not all Rastafari were alienated from the revolution at any point at all. So it's not that everybody was. But I think there were errors made in the attitude to Rastafari because some elements had turned against the process. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Questions, comments?
Oh,
no, sorry.
Yes, I want to fully endorse what Brian was saying. But I think there's another dimension of that we should consider. While I agree that the incarcerations and the jailing and so on were way out of in a sense extreme in their numbers and so on, I don't think we can separate the reality of the times from what was going on. Here's a group of guys in a very small country taking power by force of arms, knowing the threat of the United States the risk that they can be hit at any time, and concerned that, if the Americans are able to generate sufficient friends internally and work with those friends, they can topple the revolution. So a kind of paranoia may have developed, but a very natural, the conditions for it were very natural and very understandable. That people were not going to take any chances with any kind of rebellion, any kind of so-called self-expression that seemed to be out of line with the revolutionary thrust, so that there would have been an overreaction, but an overreaction that was informed or fueled by that sense of insecurity that the revolution felt. And so I don't think we should attribute it purely to subjective conditions and subjective mistakes. We must look at that objective circumstance in which the revolution was trying to survive. And even the way that some Rastafarians and others may have been treated was perhaps itself reflective of that kind of anxiety within which the revolution was functioning.
Yes, sorry.
Morris TV here. I think we have to separate or look behind or believe the lockstep of events which led to the explosion and the death of Maurice and others. Others, it's one thing to say one thing led to another, and so on. I mean, that's fine enough, but it doesn't explain. I think the underlying, from studying over and over Maurice Bernard's book, What Really Happened, and reading some of Brian's stuff, I'm struck by the particular point that Brian just raised, the element of authoritarianism in revolution. Because it seems to me that that was the problem which brought the ruin in Grenada. I mean, what has stood out for me in accounts of what happened in Grenada in those 4.5 years is the profoundly democratic instinct of the people and of those who were the members, the active members of the carrying out the revolution. Extremely democratic. But coming into conflict with the authoritarianism, which seems to be an inescapable element of creating a revolution. And the fact is that in today's world, you cannot, especially more and more, get away from the democratic element. And any element of authoritarianism runs headlong into it and has to be curtailed. So to me, those are it's that clash it's that difficulty reconciling those two, which makes it very difficult to have a revolution in today's world, quite apart from the reality of imperialism and their hostility to anything genuinely people-based and democratic. Because instinctively, I mean, the spirit driving a revolution is a spirit of people wanting to have a say. It's a democratic impulse, which can use an authoritarian tool temporarily, but must reassert itself continually. And one can see it playing out, this clash in the case of Venezuela and Nicaragua today. And therefore how imperialism is able to exploit that tension, that internal tension. Thank you.
Thank you. Since I'm sitting at the front, I'll turn around so my back is not to everyone. Good afternoon. Gillian Bristol, Director of the Latin American Caribbean Center. Everybody's calling me Ambassador Brand. Thank you for calling me Gillian. Like an old friend. It's good to see you too, Naz, my former Minister of Finance. I stand up here a little bit concerned because everyone I speak to in Grenada who was born 40 years ago or less has no clue about the Grenada Revolution, the people's revolution that took place in Grenada. They don't feel the spirit that Brian mentioned. They don't feel that spirit and that passion that I still feel. I was not as young as Heather. That's okay. But I remember that occasion, that event, or those events, with a lot of feeling. I grew up in the era that Heather described. I grew up under the tyranny of a dictator. So you talk about authoritarianism in one experience or context, you have to talk about it in the other. And the Grenadian Popular People's Revolution was a reaction to a kind of authoritarian leadership. It was violent, it was abusive, it's not well documented. The people who disappeared during that time are still just stories that families recount, that you hear about, or that you heard about. I don't know if anybody still talks about what happened during the Gary years. Yes, Gary was revered, and he is to be commended even now for leading Grenada from colonialism to statehood and to independence. But Grenada was an unwilling participant in the independence movement. And it is all the more telling, and I know Heather touched on it, but I wanted to underscore that as well. It's all the more telling why that revolution was so popular. It was also popular because it was an anti-authoritarian movement. And its popularity isn't because those of us who were there say so. Its popularity is reflected in the fact of how many Grenadians just stood up and supported that revolution. Heart, soul, minds, labor, everything we put into it. I was a child, teenager, and during those years I became a university student. But every single break I had, I was part of that Wednesday militia. Was it you, Naz, who mentioned it, or Brian? It wasn't just a Wednesday, and it was across from my house. And I was joking with my staff, who I'm very proud to see are all here with me today, from the Latin American Caribbean Center. 3 women, among them 1 Grenadian, who shall wave her flag for me. As I wave mine very proudly. Yes, this is as close to Grenada passion as I can come today, is the red in my flag, the red in my shirt. That's what it stands for, the people. Yes. So my lament today is that this history that we recount with such vivid reflections and aspirations, I still even now believe that the objectives and hopes of that time still live in us today. Whether you were part of that Grenada or you're part of this world now. And to see that it's not taught in our schools in Grenada. People have to care about it by the way. So I lament that. Maybe this University of the West Indies needs to take a leadership role in ensuring that our history is our history told by us, about us. And so I want to close by commending Samuel Braffett, who took the initiative and invited me to be here to speak today, but I didn't plan to speak right now. Thank you for the initiative, Professor Tennant. Thank you for your faculty supporting this and hosting this, and to all the speakers and panelists from so far away and right here. I've really enjoyed listening to all the presentations, and I wish there could just be more. It's a conversation that should be without an end. Thank you.
I want to thank Julian, I want to thank you for saying that, because I had a comment, perhaps a comment to you, Jermaine. You spoke of silence and disappearance. Patsy, Lewis, and I are doing some work on Grenada. We're studying how Grenadians have been able to navigate the various crises that we have experienced over time, starting with the Gary years. And when we went home in 2013, we found a willingness by the people who we engaged in the focus group discussions to speak. They were saying that this was the first chance that they had had to talk. And young people did not know about the Gary years or the revolution. And I wonder, Jermaine, if it has to do with the pain that we experienced, if some of us are still so traumatized, we probably are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Maybe we need a psychological evaluation, if that's the correct term, of the Grenadian society. For many years, some of us, I spent maybe upwards of 30 years before I could read anything on the Grenada Revolution without stopping, having a great emotional breakdown, etc. It was Ewart Lane's book about in 2015. That was the first time, Jermaine, I was able to read anything on Grenada without an emotional breakdown. Yes? And so I want to say that I feel that while you talked about the truth-telling, I don't know if it has to do with a psychological suppression of the pain that we all experienced, why truth-telling and this whole, truth and reconciliation initiative or commission was the failure that you described.
I can empathize with Heather. I had the same experience, having spent 3 years during the revolution. And when I came back here, I was asked to participate in a seminar within a few months. And as I went to speak, tears streamed down. I couldn't, and even now, I suffer, for example, when I hear helicopters, because I was living in a rural area, and the US forces were bombing that area. Planes, helicopters, I still, in fact, at times I had gone for some kind of assistance in terms of the negative emotional and psychological stress that I experienced. And I'm sure many people who have passed through, who have had that experience, share my own concerns.
Yes, Richard Jacobs. Now, the thing is that I agree completely with this issue of truth-telling. Because this is how I came to write this book that Rupert has been helping with in terms of the editing and so on. What I have found in looking at the information that is available is that at least I have counted here in this room today 5 people who know the truth. 5 people whose names are mentioned in my book who know the truth. And they do not want to tell the truth. And I ask myself, how is it possible for somebody to be parading as a truth teller when in fact he is a liar? Anyway, I won't go into that in detail because that will have to be mentioned in the details and all that stuff will come out in the book itself. But the important thing is that all of us have to tell the truth. All of us have to tell the truth.
Jermaine? Brian?
Yeah. Who is this, me?
Yeah, yes.
Who? Jermaine?
Jermaine Burke?
Yes. Okay. So, in response to Heather's comment, one of the things the two lessons we learned from the South African Truth Commission was that truth-telling leads to either re-victimization or re-traumatization. And so, any of the persons who testified before the committee, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, actually felt this pressure of re-traumatization. When I interviewed the commissioner of the Truth Commission, Father Mark Haynes, in 2013, one of the things is that many Grenadians felt that there would be long-term repercussions should they hear what they experienced during the time of the revolution. And so I think it's important to understand the psychological risks and consequences of truth-telling. But I think more importantly for me is that so much of the history was sequestered between 1986 and 2008 when all the Grenada 17 were free. So I think part of the challenge of this question of truth-telling is that there has to be a larger, more broader-based notion of having those people really provide a conduit through which we can bridge the past and the present.
Okay. Hi, Richard. I look forward to hearing your truths and seeing what they add to the story. However, I wanted to move onto the question of the party, and for us to spend at least 2 minutes reflecting on the role of the party, what it allowed to occur, and where it severely hindered the revolution. And I want to come back to Harris's point about the tension between a popular initiative and the authoritarian tendencies in the party. The person who is missing in this story, and was missing, frankly, in the story in 1970, 1983, was Cyril Lionel Robert James, who all of us on the left, I think not all of us, there were people like Richard who is there in the audience. I think I saw Richard Small, Tony Bogues and others. But all of us certainly on what we consider to be the Marxist-Leninist left, respected James in the abstract, but failed to appreciate his insights into this tension between the party and the people. In works like the Hungarian Workers' Councils, in Every Cook Can Govern, and indeed throughout the body of his work, his fear, not just of personalities, but of what the party could do to the movement and the relationship between the movement and the masses. There would have been no Grenadian revolution had there not been a force to take power in March 13. But the subsequent role of the party as an institution and as a presence in its own right contributed immensely to the crisis which arose ultimately, and on which crisis individuals played their individual parts, which is, I think, what Richard is alluding to. What were those parts? But the structure of the vanguard is something that we need to take apart and rethink. Not that the next round of revolutionary movements will operate on the same playing field, but we need to understand this tension and to recognize that what needs to be unleashed is the creative power of the people. And if the party serves to concentrate power in the hands of a few people with bright ideas, then it is going to crush the creative will of the people. And so we need to think about that again.
Colleagues from abroad, we have 7 minutes left before we will cut you off. So we're going to ask each of you if you have any comments you'd like to make before we terminate your participation. We can continue with the other colleagues who presented and who want to share any issues. Any of you have any? Yes, Brian. Naz.
Yes, thank you, Clement. I just want to, I agree with Brian's observations, but it takes us back to a fundamental point which we have to confront, that perhaps the tension between the party and the masses, perhaps the tension between the democratic instincts of the people and the authoritarian measures that is taken by the state are inevitable. Perhaps they're inevitable. The key is perhaps to find the appropriate mix, the appropriate balance. Yes, in other words, to be always mindful of it and see how best it can be managed. Today in Venezuela, the government has said, look, we're not going to allow anybody to come in here with crossing the border with food supplies and so on. Somebody looking in may say, well, the government has been authoritarian, the government has been callous, the government is not allowing food to come into the country and so on. But the government is acting out of fear. The government is fearful that its prime enemy is going to use that border to come in to destabilize and hurt the regime itself. So how do you deal with this issue? In other words, how do you, in the name of affording the democratic instincts to in a kind of free-for-all way, you open up yourself to destruction, yeah? So I don't know, I'm not suggesting that it's one or the other, I'm saying that it's an ever-present condition that people are going to, the state is going to do what it has to do to protect itself and to ensure that it continues to survive. And in doing so, where there's a bigger brother out there who you think can hurt you and is out to get you, you're going to react in ways perhaps that you will not react if that big brother was not out there making threats, issuing threats, and giving you the sense that he's going to hurt you. Yeah? So I accept what Brian is saying, and just to respond, to comment on the observation made earlier, I do believe that the tension is perhaps inevitable. Key is to be mindful of it and to be constantly trying to strike an appropriate balance.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Shamila Moses, Irana Moses from the Grenadians. Professor Meeks, this question is for you. You mentioned that the revolution happened at an opportune time and that there was an opening that they took. You also said that they missed the closing or did not recognize the closing. Can you explain that further or possibly give some examples of how they could have handled it differently?
Well, I'll try. When I say they missed closing, I think in hindsight it's 2020 vision, and I'm standing here, however many years later with 2020 vision, looking back and realizing that the minute the schism with Morris opened up around joint leadership, which didn't start as a schism, by the way, but ended up as a schism, the plot was written. The plot was written. And therefore that schism should never have opened up. The recognition that there was, that Morris's position had shifted, that there was a new correlationship between Unison and Bernard and Morris, and George Lewison had his own thing going on. A sensitivity to how to deal with personality was a critical factor at play. But overriding it all is U.S. imperialism. And, you know, we knew this. We knew they were out there in the sea, but it's like we forgot. They were in the sea practicing up by the Virgin Islands. They were in the sea of Barbados. They were up and down the Caribbean, basically saying what they were going to do. And you know, we were playing the ass.
And perhaps, if I may, just to support
2 minutes,
Brian's
because
point,
we have to relocate
the dynamic of the relationship had changed. So what started out perhaps as equal colleagues on the same plane in an organization as a team, the person who became the prime minister assumes the role, the stature, the office, the name of the traditional position of prime minister. The masses see him a certain way, the masses see the prime minister as the prime minister, and no amount of explaining, no amount of rationalizing, no amount of party discipline or any such measure is going to take away from what is embedded in the people, that the prime minister is the supreme minister, and that at the end of the day, he's on the top shelf. You know, and I think this is an issue which I agree with Brian that it really showed a lack of appreciation of that changed dynamic, notwithstanding the revolutionary context in which the whole thing was happening.
Thank you, colleagues from overseas. It's almost time for this transmission to end. We express our sincere gratitude to your participation, and for those here, we'll continue with the discussion for a few more minutes.
Thank you very much for allowing us. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Ricky Davis. I'm Jamaican. I was 12 years old when the revolution happened, and I was 16 when the invasion took place. For me, to have both of those events take place in my short lifespan was deeply embedded in my psyche. From then until now, listen to it on the radio. My connection goes even further than that, in that my youngest daughter's godmother is Grenadian, and so I've had some further association with that. But on the larger point, you mentioned the lack, how young people in Grenada don't seem to have this information. I can tell you it's not just Jamaica, not just Grenada, in Jamaica as well, there is a lack of information for young people as to what happened in the 70s coming forward. It might be a Caribbean thing, may not be, but I think it all goes back to the central theme of truth-telling. And eventually, it seems perhaps that there are many truths in between during those periods. And until the truth of the truth can be settled, what are you going to write? And so maybe Jamaica also, I mean, there's a, you know, there seems to be a disaffection for truth and reconciliation, but something needs to happen so that no matter how painful it is, the truth needs to be made known for you to be able to go forward in any meaningful way.
I think this is a very important point here. Yes. The Grenada Revolution over the last 40 years has been a cottage industry. A lot of people are writing about the revolution who know nothing about the process. They can't spell guava, they can't spell Ford, they don't know the difference between a nutmeg and a tennis ball. And I think the time has come for the University of the West Indies and the leadership of the University of the West Indies, starting with the faculty, to develop at least a course on, we can call it revolutionary processes in Grenada or the Grenada Revolution, which will encourage those persons who are interested in learning more about the process, bring persons who have been part of the process, those who want to write, and those who want to deal in truth-telling. I am very, very saddened when I see a lot of what is written about a process of which I was a part. People talk about the economy, they don't know anything about the economy, right? And they are, in fact, projected. I know a man who wrote a PhD on the Grenada Revolution. He never went to Grenada. He don't know the difference between ackee and nutmeg. And I think the time has come for us to deal with the issue in that particular context.
Yes, Irene S. Vincent. I just want to ask a question. Would you say that the authoritarian leadership of Gary was equally replaced by the authoritarian leadership of the revolution, and that the injustices of the Gary regime were equally replaced by the injustices of the revolution?
Well, from I would, well, you want to, okay, I would, Sammy, okay. I wouldn't use the word equally, but I would say that the revolution became, to a large extent, the very thing that it fought against. By repressing opposition, by locking up people, Brian alluded to it or mentioned it, locking up people who should not have been locked up in the first place. Those things led to the loss of support. The revolution had a lot of support. I remember by about the turn towards the end of 1980, I remember in our own house, my father said, perhaps the best thing that could have happened is that they didn't call the election. When the seeds when the ugly head of the revolution, elements, began to emerge. Because had they called the election right after, it would have been a clean sweep. NJM would have been in power. Perhaps they would have got all the seats, right? Maybe a few GULP Garyite strongholds would have held out. But by about 1980, that groundswell began to be eroded significantly because of how things progressed. People were locked up. You know, people would, for those of you who are young and don't know about Grenada, you would just miss Jillian. You just miss her, right? And then something would come out maybe a week or so later on where there was like a list of persons who were incarcerated, and you would realize that Jillian was, a part of the persons incarcerated. So that took place. I don't know in terms of brutality, in terms of the beating and the shooting and so on, I don't know that the revolution engaged in that kind of behavior. So, well, I don't know, right? There are people who say that it did, but I don't know of that kind of brutality. But along the way of doing the research in Grenada over the last couple of years, we did meet people who were extremely bitter, and who were saying that for the first time they got a chance to talk, to get things off their chest about what had happened to them. But I wouldn't say that they were certainly equal. But the very thing that the revolution fought against, they became, Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I don't think there is an equivalence between the Gary period and the Bishop Cord period, in the sense that the orientation of the difference, the 79-83 period had greater strategic significance in the region, particularly for the U.S. I think the Gary period, Grenada was British colony, and Gary was more seen as a kind of maverick politician, and Grenada didn't really have a strategic significance at that time. I think the elevation of Grenada's strategic significance in the 80s meant that it became a playing ground in which U.S. intelligence in particular was much more effective than in destabilizing Grenada than we make reference to. We make reference to the authoritarian thing, the authoritarian nature of Gary and the Bishop period. But strategically, given what Grenada represented in 79-83, the stakes were higher. And in that sense, the attitude of the state towards opposition tended to be more, you didn't know where your licks were going to come from, because the US, and this is a factor that I don't think has been adequately taken into account, the US outstripped Grenadian and Cuban intelligence in terms of its capacity to affect what was taking place on the ground. It's a factor that we cannot dismiss. The Cubans had no traction with respect to Grenada as the Americans did. You can send in black Americans, tourists, what have you. It was, and even within the leadership, which I don't want to go into now, the leadership was affected by intelligence. Right? No two ways about that. So I think that there's some equivalence, and I agree what Heather's conclusion is, but I think the circumstances meant that they were outmaneuvered, not only the military side, which we saw after 83, but in terms of just the sheer size of the island with respect to the threat that they face. One of the things that Brian mentioned, window of possibility. Again, this is 2020. The 2020 vision. The capacity of an island with 100,000 people to absorb the weaponry that was sent from Moscow, right, and which is documented in the memoir of Richard Jacobs, and in which Bernard was involved. I mean, that weaponry is cheese to chalk compared to what the US was able to. I mean, it was an effort at defending the thing, but it meant that Grenada would have had to, you see, one of the strongest allies, people talk about Schoon, one of the strongest allies in the Grenada process that gave it legitimacy was to keep the Governor General, right? So that kind of thinking needed to have permeated more of the period, in other words, the compromise. But this is all 2020 because ideologically at that time, the world that we saw was unraveling. The world on which Grenada had based its revolution was unraveling.
That's true.
And ideologically, it could not continue along those lines. So, in part, I'm trying to grapple with the question, but I think Gary had a revolution, which Heather referred to. And the authoritarian thing, I think, is rooted more in the political culture. And Archie Singham, of blessed memory, did a work called The Hero and the Crowd. And the Hero and the Crowd thing for Gary, as well as for the Grenada period, has some applications that I think are worthwhile considering in relationship to what that political culture can generate in terms of forms of authoritarian rule.
And the very thing Gary fought against, he became.
Yeah.
Do we have a pattern of?
David McLean from Mona School of Business. I have two quick comments and or questions. One is about the truth telling. A generation that knew about Grenada is getting older. And I think the writing. I was a teenager for Grenada. In fact, at St. Augustine, I had somebody was a neighbor of mine who would tell us stories about being active in the revolution when it started. So that's my first, and it is drawn from that. The second is about, we complain in the Caribbean about history being told by the victor, not the vanquished, and about the need for balance. And as I sit here, it strikes me that I'm not hearing from any Garyites or anybody from the GULP or people who may have been fed up with the revolution from day one. And I think it would provide that kind of balanced perspective and maybe help the truth-telling if we have the contending views and the different perspectives of what equates to truth, if there. So I won't call out anybody, but as somebody who came of age in the late 70s, early 80s, we know the names, we know the involvement, allegedly, of Jamaica and the university in that Caribbean revolutionary period. So I'm imploring the actors, write so that your story is not told by somebody else.
Can I just say one thing? David, there is a book by George Griffith, a Grenadian, who was a member of Gary's administration. He's written, and he was trying to get this work to be reading material here. So he wrote to me and he wrote to Patsy, and he was trying to get the material. Of course, I was not teaching in that area, etc. But I ended up being unkind to George Griffith by saying to him that the Gary he painted in that book was not the person I knew. You know, and I felt very...
Did he say you were too young to know?
No, he didn't say I was too, but I mean, I might have been young, but you know, I think I have fact-checked my memory against my, you know, parents and others authoritative sources that have written. But yes, so that is one thing that is available, and Garyites would be very happy with George Griffith's account of the Gary period.
Susan Goff. I just want to pick up on the issue of the history, the lack of it being taught, the comments made that it's not only in Grenada but in Jamaica as well. It's not only about the Grenada Revolution but also about the 70s, the period of the 70s in Jamaica. And my son, who was not born at the time of the revolution, in conversations about the 70s, keeps pointing out that there is a lack of information and that there is a generation, a large number of young people who are hungry for the information and don't have ready access to it. I endorse the need for the university to develop materials and courses. I endorse the need for those who were participants to tell their story from their perspective in one way or another. Speak it on a tape to be released 20 years after your death, if that is what you feel comfortable with. But don't let it pass. And also the important point that the information has also got to be translated into forms that the young people will access, because not all of them are going to come to a course at the university. Not all of them are going to read a book, you know, 300, 400 pages long. But these days, there's the internet, there is YouTube, there are all these various other means by which the stories that they need to hear are made available.
Can I do a poll here? There are young Grenadians here. Have you learned anything from this seminar?
Yeah, a lot.
So there's need for us to continue dialogue of this nature.
So, you have 5 more.
Okay, 5 more questions and then we'll...
I'm sorry to be up again, but I just wanted to ask the question to Professor Meeks, but I wanted to make the point that for a majority of my early years. I was born December 82. I did not even know that the revolution was something to care about. It was just the Grenada Revolution. It wasn't spoken about in my house, nothing. As I grew older, I gained an appreciation over time. My first real recognition that I know absolutely nothing was when I went to university in Texas. I met an old white guy from Texas who was a pilot in the US military, who was part of the nation. And he was like, I don't even know why we went there. We were just told that we had to go on this mission. And a lot of the US soldiers died because they did not understand the terrain of Grenada. And they underestimated the firepower of the Grenadians when they got there. That being said, I think we have to be careful. We are in danger of Grenada's history, the revolution, being totally lost. There is a generation born in the last 10 to 15 years that do not care about the revolution. I have seen it on social media over the years. People from my age group care more about it. In the last 2 years, I've had friends from all over, thanks to Facebook, who have committed to supporting an effort to bring this back to the children. Because when I was in secondary school, in the first 2 years, you're taught about Caribbean history. You learn about the Jamaican uprisings. Grenada's history was never taught beyond being discovered by Columbus and the Amerindians. There was nothing in our school books about Grenada's revolution. I came to Jamaica a year ago and I met Jamaicans who are like, Grenada is like a strong powerhouse because of the revolution. I learned from the US history recollections of how significant the revolution was. A lot was done in 4 years. We do not speak of that. There has not been a government in Grenada since then to make such an impact in such a short space of time. And I've always held the view that as small as we are, with the limited resources we have, if we focus on what we have and how we can develop it, we can still be a strong and powerful nation. We don't have to be extremely extra like every other country in order for us to develop. So that's where I'll leave my piece.
I think this is a very important point. The US, upon invading Grenada, took tons of documents to North America. These documents are located in the US military archives. You can't go in there with anything. They give you pen and paper. It costs 5 US cents a page to photocopy anything. I know this because in some of the research I was doing, this is the only place where the records are. And I think the time has come, it was tried in the past, for the leadership of the region to demand that the US gives us back these documents, put them in the archives in somewhere across the region, so that scholars who wish to access this information can access it freely. Because to pay 5 cents a page, or you could do like me, photocopy 5 pages and tell them it's 2. But the point is, it is the information belonging to the people of the Caribbean, the people of Grenada, and I think this information needs to reside in our region.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I was just saying, Richard Jacobs, I was just thinking about adding a footnote because I know that it's not in there. But nevertheless, about this whole question of authoritarianism, just as a piece of information, because I came back from Cuba after I had been assigned there to have a consultation with Morris and the members of the Central Committee and the Political Bureau. And the issue was that I had heard that Patamanian, who had been appointed to be the ambassador for the Caribbean as a whole, CARICOM, had given up his post because he said that there was torture going on in Grenada. I contacted Pat, and he wasn't in a position to talk to me at the time. And I went to Morris and said, look, this is what I have heard. And I would like to know how true it is. And so Morris said to me, well, I tell you something. I also heard this, that there was torture going up in the jail. And I went up there myself and investigated the whole thing. And he told me that there was a particular person who he had appointed to be responsible for some of the political prisoners in the jail. And he had personally released all those people who he had gathered from his own investigation was involved in this torture business. And he had prohibited, this is 1980, and he had prohibited any further punishment for anybody unless they get his own personal approval. And you know, anybody knows, of course, was opposed to that kind of torture behavior. So that's just as a footnote. I didn't put it in the document, but it is useful when we come to analyze the role of the NJM in the whole political process.
Okay, any other, one final question or comment? More than one, okay.
I was just going on the point where there's a call for information to be put together. And I think right now at the UE Museum, there's an excellent template with what they have done about the Rodney riots and asking for persons to contribute to what they have as memory. And it's snippets and it's basically crowdsourcing. And the thing is that we have so many platforms for crowdsourcing information now, whether it be fragments of text, letters, audio, what people recall. My earliest awareness of this revolution was through a student of Grenada, Angus Steele, who came here to do a degree in the 80s. I came here to you in 87, and he had a very bad wound from a bullet that he had been shot in the revolution. And you know, sometimes he would talk and sometimes it was too much to talk about what he had experienced being involved in this revolution. And somebody thought, Claremont mentioned about a course about the Grenada Revolution, but we have so many other examples of revolution. We could have a course on the Caribbean Revolution. The point is that I was lucky enough to have had my awareness sparked, but again, many others have missed that time. And so for those who have whatever fragment, whether it was through involvement or knowing persons who are involved, or who might have some kind of documentary evidence, to find ways to crowdsource it and begin the process of bringing it together. And then the sifting can begin, because then that is where we will get the collective memory.
Okay, colleagues, I have to use an authoritarian approach in a democratic way. And to indicate
Yes, yes.
I just felt as though I should say something since I am of the younger generation. So I do agree with a lot of what she had to say regarding a lot of younger people just not caring because they don't know that there's something to care about. I personally did not know that the revolution was such a big event until I came to Jamaica about 3 years ago, and I finally know. I can say, however, that over the past couple of years, I have made an effort to educate myself on the issue. Over the Christmas break, I went home. I am a journalism student, by the way. I went home and I did some interviews with some people, and I am currently producing a radio documentary on the revolution. That should be finished at the end of this month. And it's so interesting, while speaking to Grenadians who would have been a part of the revolution and who would have been affected, that it goes a lot further than what we would be told in school. We're kind of forced to learn the dates. When did we get independence? When did the revolution happen? But we don't really know what a revolution is and how it's affected Grenadians. I live literally 10 seconds, if all that, away from a minister from Visual government, and I had no idea all my life. I had no idea. I live 20 seconds, if all that, away from one of the Grenada 17, and I had no idea. So it's so interesting how just a little, maybe a little push in the right direction could go a long way, at least for my generation.
Okay, we are going to terminate now. Two things. I'm told to inform you that there are refreshments in the gazebo, and I am to request Dr. Dacia Leslie, Research Fellow, SALISES, to give the vote of thanks. And this is where, once she's finished the vote of thanks, that's it. Thank you all for coming. This is my task completed.
Excellent engagement. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion, which marks 40 years since the Grenada Revolution and highlights the importance of cross-pollination of ideas in helping to give meaning and context to important events which have helped to shape Caribbean culture. I would like to thank our panelists for sharing with us their important work and perspectives on the subject, namely Mr. Victor Burke, Professor Rupert Lewis, Professor Clinton Hutton, Dr. Jermaine McCalpin, former Director of SALISES, Professor Brian Meeks, Dr. Heather Ricketts, and Professor Curtin for competently chairing the session. I would also like to once again acknowledge and thank our special guests, Mr. Bernard Cord, Honorary Consul Kenneth Sylvester, Ambassador Gillian Bristol, President of the Grenadian Student Society, Ms. Charles, Deans of faculty present, Grenadian expats in attendance. I also note the presence of Professor Trevor Monroe, who has been extremely silent because I recall him teaching me some of these things as an undergrad student. And as Ambassador Bristol alluded to earlier on when she initiated the vote of thanks, this event would not have been possible without the wise direction and pragmatism of Professor David Tennant, Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, and Professor Aldrin Henry Lee, University Director of SALISES. Of course, like she said, the vision of this discussion is that of Dr. Samuel Brathwaite, who led the organizing committee and worked tirelessly to ensure that it was a job well done. Well done. Thanks to the kind support and input of Stephanie Pinnock, Raven Reed, Richard Leach, Keisha Gale Williams, Rochelle Banton, Kevin Fraser, Orin Spence, staff of the Department of Government, the MITS Instructional Support Systems for recording and streaming the session, online viewers, and of course, participants in the audience. Give yourself a round of applause. I also like to thank Professor Jacobs for his controversial contributions, but which are extremely valid and valued. It's important to note that he is also the relative of Sir Arthur Lewis, which is extremely important. It shows the extensiveness of your experience. Just to say that I would encourage you to continue the discussion over light refreshments, as Professor Curtin mentioned. It's been served at the SALISES gazebo, which is located downstairs. Thank you. Yes?
I would like to make an announcement.
Yeah?
Sorry, I would like to make an announcement. Tomorrow at 6 p.m. at the Undercraft, there's going to be a forum on United States intervention in Venezuela. It's from 6 to 9 p.m. and you're all invited to attend.